Fabulous, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being here. I appreciate you joining me today for one of the most significant milestones of my entire life, which is the presentation and defense of my dissertation entitled The Relationship Between a Leadership Team, Diversity Characteristics, and Strategic Change. It is a meta-analytic review, and since no presentation is officially started until the speaker introduces themselves, I will use one of my favorite introductions, which is to say, my name is Amy Horner, and I love change. I love change so much that 3.5 years ago when I first spoke with this gentleman, Dr. Reggie Silver, about the possibility of entering this program, I already knew what I wanted to study. Do you remember that conversation?
And you have been consistent.
So in addition to checking some boxes for my dissertation requirements so that I can hopefully graduate from this program in May, my dissertation aims to do 3 things. I wanted to clarify the relationship between leadership team diversity characteristics and strategic change, because it seems to be a little bit muddy. I also wanted to understand the extent to which that relationship has any sort of relation or power in existing literature, and I wanted to take a look at the conflicting results that exist in extant research, because I was sad that people weren't agreeing about one of my favorite topics on the whole planet, which is the intersection of diversity and change. Everyone knows what strategic change is, right? You could all define it for me if I wasn't standing up here. So strategic change is an outcome. It is something that we can measure that has already happened. We have financial statement metrics. Get excited, Melissa Galasso, CPA in the room. We have financial statement metrics that we can look at 2 points. And the difference in those 2 points indicates a change in strategy. Now that change in strategy comes from a reaction to external factors that are happening somewhere out in the world, outside of what's happening in the organization. And leadership's team reaction to those external factors is going to be either to address a threat or a problem, or to take advantage of an opportunity. So that is the definition of strategic change. Now that you all know it, I know you're excited. As I was reading, as I was training myself to read riveting academic articles, because they are a little different than what we're used to out there in industry, I started to pay attention to leadership team diversity characteristics and those specific studies. 5 diversity characteristics are primarily included: gender, age, tenure, functional background, and educational background. And what I found was there was that conflict, disagreement in the results of other studies as to whether or not diversity had a positive impact on the likelihood of strategic change or a negative impact. And instead of contributing to the noise or the conflict, I approached Dr. Banks and I said, what do you think about the possibility of doing a meta-analytic review? So I could take a lot of different studies, technical term, a lot, and look at them all together. And he said, it depends. You're a true academic, George. It depends on 2 things. And what you need to do is create a plan. I said, I like to create a good plan. Let's create a good plan. And George said, I need to come up with some parameters. And once you come up with those parameters, Amy, then you need to do a search. So here are the parameters I came up with. Incredibly broad, as you can see. An article needed to include strategic change as a variable. It needed to provide correlation coefficients, or I needed to get them from the author of the original article. And then our article also needed to disclose the sample size. Now, of course, the article also needed to include at least one variable for diversity characteristics. And once I had these parameters, I got to jump into some academic databases and do a great big search. And so I searched on things, keywords like leadership team and strategic change, leadership and strategic change and diversity. And I very quickly realized that I stink at searching academic databases because I came up with 8,600 results. I was not about to read 8,600 papers. And so I went back to those parameters, and using those parameters and searching the abstract, I very quickly cut this down to a much more reasonable number, somewhere in the mid-50s. There was a little bit of back and forth work, whether or not an article was going to be usable for what I wanted to do. And so at the time that I did my proposal last year in August with committee, I was right around 29, which I was excited because, you know, I'm superstitious and 9 is a good omen for me. And so with those 29 articles, I had written intro, lit review, and methods. My committee gave me a thumbs up. And at that point in time, I reran that search because this first search happened at the end of December. So I reran it in September of last year just to make sure if anything had been written since then, I could be reasonably confident that I had grabbed it. So I ended up with 25 articles in the Meta, 178 independent variables with a relation to strategic change, and a big N of over 518,000. I wish it was dollars instead of like an N, but you know, we can only do what we can do. And so once I had all this information, I had to do a little bit of analysis, number crunching, definitely my favorite part. And the part for which my chair was probably like, make sure you know what you're doing. So I applied a random effects model with our metaphor package that enabled a structural approach for my meta-analysis. And this uses regression techniques to examine how the characteristics relate across studies. So we're kind of creating a very large common set in the data set. And then I also used local boy, Scott Tony Dandle, of the famous Charlotte Tony Dandle family, to use his relative weights and relative importance analysis through something called the Shiny app. And much like being disappointed that my $500,000 wasn't dollars, the Shiny app wasn't quite as exciting and shiny as I thought it was going to be. I have 5 hypotheses that I tested in R using that metaphor package. The very first focused on the leadership team diversity characteristic of tenure. And I had posited that the longer tenure a leadership team was, the less likelihood that we would have a relationship with strategic change. So what you're focusing on these slides is the relationship in these red circles. So I said it would have a negative relation, it has a positive relation, so this first hypothesis not supported. Interesting, right? For my second hypothesis, I took a look at age diversity. And I wanted to assume that if we had a broader array of ages at the table, we would have a positive relation to strategic change. And although that 0.01 is a tiny number, it is still positive. So I'm taking that as a victory. So this hypothesis supported. Now we get to functional diversity. Functional diversity are things like, are you an accountant? Are you an IT person? Are you a marketing person? And I assumed, I hypothesized, that functional diversity in the leadership team would have a positive relationship with strategic change. And lo and behold, even though this is a super tiny number, it is a negative number, showing that this particular hypothesis also not supported. And then I turned my attention to gender. And this is where it gets interesting. I assumed that a gender diverse leadership team would have a positive relation to strategic change. I have a positive 0 result as opposed to a negative 0 result, which I know Dr. Silver is really excited about. Showing essentially that gender diversity on a leadership team had a neutral impact on strategic change. Nothing at all. Flipping my attention to the board, also assumed that board member gender diversity, here's my personal bias as a woman, right? Positive relation to strategic change, a negative 0. I know your mind is blown. You have to ask George if you really want to understand it. But again, it's a 0, right? And what the positive and negative means is just very, very far out to the right when we get to multiple decimal places, there is some sort of number that has come up in this analysis. But also showing that gender diversity of this large group of people has a neutral impact on strategic change. So nothing is really happening, which I thought was absolutely fascinating from this big data set. Now, whether or not you met Joe, my significant other is in the room, and this might be his favorite slide of all time, because this is what I'm gonna admit. In a slide deck, in front of a room of people, being recorded, that I made a bunch of assumptions, and I might not have hit the mark. We don't use the W word in my house. At least not for me. But I thought this was really interesting, and so what? Who cares, right? What is this telling us? I'll get to that in a minute. I was just really excited to use that picture in a slide. Now, I told you I also took a look at 2 of my research questions and wanted to run a relative weights analysis through that Shiny app. Now, what that Shiny app does is it takes 2 variables and it compares those variables. It assigns a relative weight to those variables. So you can see if we just look at, in kind of a vacuum, firm age and leadership team gender diversity, that with those 2, leadership team gender diversity is having a significantly larger weight relation influence predictor of strategic change. And then the same thing with research question 2, taking a look at board tenure only up against board size. And we can see that board size is going to be the more important predictor for strategic change. I actually really liked this app a lot. I thought it was cool. And I thought it was really cool that it came from right down the hall. So it's really interesting to be able to use information, I think, in applications of people that kind of have a 1 or 3 degree of separation from. So overview of results. What happened? I was kind of inaccurate in my assessments, right? And my hypothesizing, but what does that mean, right? The diversity characteristics tested in the study had a relatively minor or almost 0 impact on strategic change, meaning that there must be something other than the people at the board table who are impacting strategic change. I thought that was really interesting that diversity wasn't a huge deal, and that the analyses that I performed on the gender characteristic were showing neutral results. I could argue that that means there's no reason not to have a full room of women at the table if you're not going to see a difference when you have gender diversity, which I think, given some other things that are going on in the state of the world right now, is an incredibly interesting result. I learned a lot, honestly, through doing this. But what was really learned is that my mind was blown, right? So when you need to run strategic change, a strategic change initiative in your organization, you have to create a strategic plan, right? We need a plan, we need a roadmap. Change just doesn't happen by itself. One of the things I learned, and this is counter to what I've done for the last 15 years of my life, is that a strategic plan might not always be the best and most necessary plan for an organization. Depending on the life cycle of the organization, economic conditions, an operating plan might be just as effective. But like I mentioned a minute ago, with gender diversity having a close to neutral impact on strategic change, it really seems to remove the argument that women should not be in the room, or that they should not be in positions of leadership when an organization needs to go through a change. And I really thought that that was kind of fascinating. There are limitations, of course, in the study. The first of which is probably the person who's presenting this study to you. This is, of course, the first ever dissertation that I've done, and my first attempt at research, although I had a wonderful committee and an extraordinary chair to lead me through this and to listen to all my griping and complaining. It's seemingly impossible to capture all of the variables. My research shows that those diversity characteristics didn't have a huge impact on strategic change, right? But what other variables might have been out there? It doesn't seem like that relationship is linear. So what might I have missed? What might have been unobserved in the initial studies that would be creating a limitation on this meta-analytic review? And then, of course, like I covered a little bit earlier, the articles identified in systematic search, I had 33 that fit most of my parameters, but they couldn't be used because they didn't fit all the parameters, which was a bummer because, 3 times 3 is 9, so I was pretty stoked when that first worked out. A recommendation I have, there were a lot of inconsistencies across the studies that I took a look at. And the first, and this blew my mind as a business person, as a degreed accountant, there is not an agreed upon calculation for strategic change. If you were to ask 5 different researchers what their definition and calculation of strategic change was, you'd probably get at least 3 different answers. And for someone who knows what return on assets is, or knows how you calculate profit margin, this was a little unsettling for me. Like, how are we studying something if we don't know how we're measuring it, and we're not measuring it consistently? So there is a strategic resource allocation profile, consists of 6 financial statement ratios. Fascinating for those of you who love math or ratios. But I think the 6 in and of itself, they're a good place to start if that's where we want to come up with a consistent measurement, but they're very heavily weighted towards manufacturing. And so other types of businesses wouldn't really be able to use them. So I would recommend keeping, of the 6, advertising intensity, keep overhead metrics, keep your inventory level, certainly keep financial leverage. We need to know how organizations are leveraged. The 2 I would throw out from that strategic resource allocation profile are research and development intensity, really only for manufacturing, as well as property, plant, and equipment newness. So in making that recommendation, someone or someone's to come up with an agreed upon measurement, I think would be really impactful on how we take a look at strategic change. And then there are also various approaches to the definition of diversity characteristics. So making it challenging to do an apples to apples comparison. And the one that I point out here is educational background. So here in the US, when we look at a US study, we really have 5 levels, right? High school, bachelor's, master's, doctorate, some high school. I did those in reverse order. But over in Europe, they have more like 8 categories, which, you know, some of them are similar and some of them aren't. So we're not really necessarily comparing apples to apples. So strongly recommend that those inconsistencies be addressed.
Kind of just a really quick clarifying question about the definitions here. So what you're recommending in terms of like the measurement approach, because obviously there's inconsistency here, would all of these measurement approaches be positively balanced such that strategic change, the way that they're measuring it, is always a good thing, or is there variance as well where sometimes strategic change could actually be bad or, you know, be a harmful thing or something that was undesired?
Mm-hmm. Beauty is always in the eye, of course, of the beholder. None of the strategic change literature makes a definitive statement or stance on whether or not strategic change is healthy or unhealthy, good or bad. It is simply trying to identify whether or not it happened.
What would you recommend there then in terms of?
I started this out by saying I love change, George.
Okay.
So I am highly biased towards change. I think that without change, we would still probably be all riding horse and buggies, and things might be a little different here. So as an advocate of change, you know, I do think change is good. Along the lines of implementing change, I do think that there needs to be a mechanism to reassess and to potentially change the direction. But going backwards to what was is probably not the right way to go.
Yeah. So if I could summarize then, sticking with an objective measure of strategic change, right? It doesn't have like a subjective opinion
Correct.
if it's good or bad.
Correct. Which is why financial statements are so great, right? You can't really argue with the financials, and you hope they're accurate. And in publicly traded companies, they are accurate within reasonable misstatement, because that's what the auditors have to do. So a little bit of future research recommendations that came out of this work. I might do some of this, we'll see, because I think it's really, really fascinating, is to take a look at what is happening outside of the organization, right? Industry dynamics, market conditions, economic climate, and culture of different countries. But then also taking a look internally, what is happening with the CEO? What's the CEO's influence versus the leadership team? And does prior financial performance have an impact on strategic change? If we can afford to do more with what we have, are we more likely to pursue strategic change in our organization? Of course, I have to have a contribution. There has to be a reason for the 102 pages that some of you got to read. And I certainly recommend a further evaluation of the external factors that are happening in strategic change. If you remember the definition, right, it's a change in strategy. It's a resource allocation. It is an organization's reaction to external factors of a threat or problem or an opportunity that an organization might be able to take advantage of. in and of that definition, it's already telling us that diversity isn't impacting it. There's no diversity mentioned in that definition. I think when we kind of go back to it, maybe trying to say that diversity impacts strategic change isn't likely to happen. I would really love to see an expansion of the individual diversity characteristics versus as a single construct. I mentioned this quite a bit in my paper. Some authors try to look at diversity as one thing instead of as individual things. And I think that continues to muddy the waters. And then also to really challenge the linear relationship between diversity and strategic change. Those outcomes show that diversity isn't really impacting strategic change much, if at all. So is this really something that we need to spend so much time worrying about or continuing to do research on? So in conclusion, I hit it if George hadn't asked me this question. This is a really interesting and illuminating project for me, right? This is where strategic change initiatives, strategic planning, and organizational transformation is where, as an executive, I've spent the last 15 years of my career. And I'm such a big fan of lifetime learning and continuous education. This changed my mind and changed my lens on a lot of the work that I do out there in the real world. It's changed the way I've looked at change. It's changed the way I look at strategy. I'm really fascinated now to go out there and look at the external factors that are driving decisions inside organizations. CEO origin, I would love to do some research on this because this really fascinates me. CEO origin is whether or not someone's promoted from inside or they're hired from outside, and what happens to strategy when that change in that influencing seat takes place. And then of course we did have a little bit of leadership team influence on outcome and decisions. Something that's not listed up here is I've written a new keynote that will be launched later this year that's steeped in my research, which is really exciting, right? Because I'll get to share this beyond the academic borders. So that's all I have. Open the floor to questions